we're going to move on to American commitment in the Vietnam War. Yesterday we talked about strategy, the American and South Vietnamese strategy. We talked about the North Vietnamese strategy, keeping in mind that the North Vietnamese did not play by the rules. And it will not be the first time. We'll talk about that later. Okay? American commitment in the Vietnam War. What is our commitment at this point, basically?
If we are attacked, we will fight back.
But we don't even have combat troops there. Really, we have advisors. Okay? Now, the thing that's going to make this war different than the Korean War or World War II or World War I and involve Americans back home more is going to be the new introduction of what? Television. Television. Very good. Because this is going to be the first television war in history where you're going to get immediate feedback as American citizens on how we're doing in Vietnam because of television. That wasn't the case in the Korean War, certainly wasn't the case in World War II, World War I. They did have movies they made, propaganda movies and those types of things that we saw, but not a nightly news flash of what was going on. Now, I want you to write down this quote because it's going to be an important one. In late October 1964, this is what President Johnson stated publicly. In late October of 1964, this is what President Johnson stated publicly to the American people. Late October 1964. I want you to listen to it the first time, and I'll repeat it many times, but tell me what you think he's saying. He said, quote, "We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." Okay? We'll do that again. We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. He said this in late October 1964. He stated publicly, we are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. One more time. We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. So what's he telling the American people in October of 1964? We're not going to commit troops to Vietnam. That's what he's saying. We'll see how that goes. The reason I want you to write it down is I want you to see how this progresses. That's why we call it commitment, okay? Well, by January of 1965, we still had advisors in Vietnam, approximately 7,000. Okay, now that's up from the what that Kennedy sent. Anybody remember? 1,600, which is up from what? 8. Didn't it go from 8 to 16?
You said 16,000.
Oh, 16,000, yes, I'm sorry, 16,000. So it went from, so there were 7,000 Americans. I must have screwed that up.
You said 16,000.
You said 16,000.
Yeah, it should have been 6,000. Not 6,000. Yeah, 6,000. Kennedy sent 6,000, and Johnson's going to send 7,000. Yeah, sorry about that. Did I say 16? I probably did.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you said from during Kennedy presidency, the number of military advisors rose from 800 to 1,600. That's what I had.
that's 1,600 is what I thought I said. But anyway, that's okay.
But now it's so
So I'm sorry, it's 1,600. Boy, I'm going to get you.
Oh my God.
6,000.
Because I have 16,000.
Eisenhower
You
said
write the number up
800,
on the
right?
board.
Here's what it was. Very good. Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson.
I got 16,000.
1,600?
No, I got.
Yeah, it should be 16. Well, let's look and see what I got in my notes.
You wrote 1,600 instead of 16,000.
In my notes, I have
Because I had.
16,000, which is incorrect.
Oh,
I wrote
Okay,
1,600.
1,600, that's correct.
She'll just wait.
Okay, moving on. Here we go. So in January of 1965, there were 7,000 American advisors in Vietnam. That is going to change after an incident that occurs in February of 1965. So there's 7,000 American advisors in Vietnam in January of 1965. That's going to change because of an incident that happens there in February of 1965. A VC or guerrilla attack, if I say guerrilla that means VC, but a VC or guerrilla attack happened in that month on a U.S. military unit. So the VC guerrillas attacked a U.S. military unit that was full of what? Advisors. Okay? And when they attacked that military unit in February of 1965, 7 Americans were killed and around 100 more were wounded. So in February of 1965, a Viet Cong guerrilla attack on a United States military unit resulted in 7 Americans killed and nearly 100 wounded. Now, who has full authority to do whatever he wants about this? President Johnson, as a result of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And what he did to retaliate for these 7 American deaths and the 100 wounded is he sent the first combat troops into South Vietnam after this incident. So the first combat troops, non-advisors, end up in Vietnam shortly after those 7 Americans and 7 Americans were killed and 100 more were wounded in February of 1965. And what branch of the military were those combat troops?
Marines.
Marines. Okay, Marines. Okay? So, the first troops go in February of 1965. By April 1st of 1965, there were 28,000 combat troops now in South Vietnam. Okay? So by April 1st of 1965, almost 50 years ago, President Johnson had 28,000 combat troops in Vietnam. That's by April 1st. By the end of that year, in 1965, there were 190,000 American combat troops in Vietnam. So by the end of 1965, 190,000 combat troops. And we had approximately 2,500 casualties, American casualties by that time. Now let's talk about what a casualty is so we understand. What's a casualty?
It's a injury in battle.
Or
Death.
death. So killed in battle or injured in battle, wounded. Okay? Those are casualties. So by the end of 1965, casualties numbered approximately 2,500, and there were over 190,000 American Marines in Vietnam. 2,500. So let's continue on because we're talking about American commitment. By the end of 1966, approximately 30,000 casualties, that would be killed or wounded, and over 400,000 Marines, combat troops in Vietnam. So by the end of 1966, there were over 400,000 combat troops, which would be Marines, Army, combination, and approximately 33,000 casualties by the end of 66. 33,000 casualties, 400,000 combat troops. Yep. So by the end of 1966, there were over 400,000 combat troops in Vietnam and approximately 33,000 American casualties. The end of 1967, over 500,000 combat troops in Vietnam, over 500,000, casualties over 100,000. So by the end of 1967, there were over 500,000 combat troops in Vietnam, and American casualties had risen to over 100,000. Now I want you to think about that. In late October 1964, President Johnson says publicly, "We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." By the end of 1967, we had 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam and 100,000 casualties. So what happens by the end of 1967 that has never really happened in a war in our history? Well, possibly we could be thinking that, but what might that cause if we thought we were getting beat?
Draft.
Well, people began to question the war for the first time by the end of 1967. Prior to that, we have always been committed to American freedom and supporting our war efforts, supporting the President's decisions to go to war. Well, when we had 500,000 combat troops in Vietnam by the end of 1967, and our casualties had risen to over 100,000, after Johnson said in 1964 he wasn't going to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles to do what Asian boys, 9,000 or 10,000 miles to do for American boys doing what Asian boys should be doing, people began to question it. So we start for the first time for people to go, maybe this isn't a very good idea. Okay? Now, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which is 1967, a tough year for the United States and Vietnam. And these are the things that happened in 1967, other than the little bit of statistics I gave you, that made people question the war. Okay? I'm going to give you 5 reasons why the year 1967 was a very tough year for the United States and Vietnam. 5 reasons why the year 1967 was a very tough year for the United States and Vietnam. How many casualties had we talked about ballpark just a minute ago? Over 100,000, right? Well, here's the exact numbers sorted. We had in excess of that approximate 100,000, it was actually worse. Approximately 27,000 American soldiers had been killed in Vietnam. Had been killed, okay? So in excess of 27,000 American soldiers had been killed in Vietnam by the end of 1967. The numbers that were wounded, and most seriously wounded, because you had to be kind of seriously wounded to be a casualty. I mean, if you got what they called $1 million wound, where you got shot in the arm, and they patched you up and sent you back into battle, that really wasn't a casualty. But if they shot your arm off, and you didn't get back to battle, that was a casualty. That was a seriously wounded person. 92,000 by the end of 1967. That's the second reason. So, first reason why 1967 was a tough year for the United States and Vietnam is we had over 27,000 American soldiers killed. We had over 92 soldiers seriously wounded. 92,000. Yeah.
And that's number 2, right? Number 2.
Yes.
Okay.
Number 3, the financial cost of the war was absolutely staggering. You know what the war in Vietnam was costing the United States per day?
$1 million.
$1 million a day by the end of 1967. $1 million a day. This war cost us $500 billion before we were done. Oh, about $500 billion. Okay, so it's an incredibly expensive war. So by the end of 1967, number 3, the financial cost of the war was staggering. We were paying approximately $1 million a day to fight this war. Another thing, number 4, why it was such a tough year, by the end of 1967, the Vietnam War had become the second longest war in American history. Second longest war in American history. Anybody want to guess what war lasted longer?
World War II.
No?
Cold War?
Revolutionary.
Cold War?
Revolutionary War.
Oh, never mind.
Yeah, that's okay. The Cold War did last longer. It just wasn't quite a conflict, but you're right on that. But the Revolutionary War was the only war in American history that had lasted longer than Vietnam.
How long did it last?
Well, we actually get out of there. We'll get to that, but it's in the early 70s. So, okay, number 5. Growing opposition to the Vietnam War. By the end of 1967, we had tremendous growing opposition, which we had never seen before. Everybody supported us when we were in war. In Korea, they supported us. Nobody's out protesting the Korean War. Nobody's out protesting World War II. But at the end of 1967, you're going to start to see these things happen, which we'll talk about. Now, if you're President Johnson, what are you going to do to curb this opposition by these people? These people are now starting to oppose war. How are you going to convince these people that they shouldn't do that? Kind of propaganda. What? God, you two. Johnson wanted someone to assure the American people that we were winning. Who would he have do that? You haven't heard of him yet. This fellow right here, General William Westmoreland. He was the overall commander of American forces in Vietnam. So Johnson calls General William Westmoreland back from Vietnam, and he wants him to go on national television and ensure the American people that we are winning the war there. Don't panic. I know we've had some setbacks, but we're actually winning. So, to curb the opposition to the war, President Johnson brought General William Westmoreland, who was the overall commander of American forces in Vietnam, back from Saigon to the United States. Well, the first thing Johnson did, I kind of got ahead of myself, is Johnson asked Westmoreland, are we winning this war? And Westmoreland assured him that we were winning the war. And that's when he asked him to reassure the American people and go on national television and give his opinions to the American people. So he did that on November 21st, 1967. On November 21st, 1967, General Westmoreland made a public statement on national television about the military progress in Vietnam. Now, if you were listening, you don't need to write this down, I want you to listen to it. If you were listening to this, what would you think? He said, quote, "I am absolutely certain that whereas in 1965 the enemy was winning, today he is certainly losing. There are indications that the Viet Cong and even Hanoi know this. We have reached an important point when the end begins to come into view." Now, if your overall commander of your forces told you that on national television, you would be more reassured, and people were. His statement assured Americans that the war in Vietnam was being won and it would soon be over. So we became a little more optimistic and we quit doubting it, okay? The protests really haven't gone crazy yet, okay? And this helped curb that. So he gave that spiel and the American people became more optimistic than ever. They could see victory in sight. The overall commander assured them that was going to be the case. Unfortunately, an event occurred 10 weeks later that would end optimism forever concerning Americans' opinions on Vietnam. Just 10 weeks later, after he got on national television, about 2.5 months later, around that area, something happened that would end the optimism forever and would make the American people think that they weren't being told the truth in Vietnam. Anybody want to guess what that event was? The Tet Offensive. Okay, and we'll talk about that. That's our next subtopic. The Tet Offensive. What is January 30th of 1968 in Vietnam? It's the New Year. It's just like our January 1st. Okay, it's just like our January 1st. So January 30th of 1968 was the first day of the Vietnamese New Year. What did they call it? Tet. That was their name for the first day of the New Year. So in Vietnam, the New Year doesn't start January 1st. It starts January 30th. Okay, and that's called Tet. And what is that? What happened? Are you guys going to sit up and listen to me throw words at you or did you on January 1st of last year? No, because it was what? Doggone holiday. Okay? So, on this infamous date of January 30th, 1968, the first day of the Vietnamese New Year, Tet, which is a holiday, the North Vietnamese guerrillas launched a massive attack through South Vietnam. Just a massive attack. So on January 30th, 1968, the first day of the Vietnamese New Year, also known as Tet, the North Vietnamese guerrillas launched a massive attack throughout the entire country of South Vietnam. They not only hit military targets in South Vietnam, they also hit civilian targets. Because what's their philosophy? Terrorism. Okay? So the Viet Cong on that date made military strikes without warning at both civilian and military targets throughout South Vietnam. We were not very prepared for that. Why?
We were
It's a
celebrating.
war holiday, and we followed that forever. You don't fight on a war holiday. Well, nobody told the North Vietnamese, and even if they did, they could have cared less. So the American and South Vietnamese forces were unprepared, as this was an incredibly big surprise to them because it occurred on a war holiday. And you're not supposed to fight, according to the rules of war, on a holiday. It's happened throughout our country's history. Until when? Tet. Okay? Well, within a 24-hour period of time, more than 84,000 Viet Cong soldiers had stormed 3 different strategic areas in South Vietnam. Okay? Within a 24-hour period of time, more than 84,000 Viet Cong soldiers stormed the following strategic areas in South Vietnam.
How many?
How many? 3 strategic areas.
No, how many?
Oh, 84,000. What would be a strategic area if you're attacking civilian and military targets? What would be one strategic area, I'm going to tell you? What?
Saigon.
We'll get, God, you're saving my surprise. What'd you say? Cities and towns. That would be your assault upon civilians. 40 different city and towns in South Vietnam were assaulted by the Viet Cong on this Tet holiday. 40 South Vietnamese cities and towns ravaged those civilians. So what else? If they're going to attack military installations, they're going to hit bases. 12 United States military bases were attacked. 12 United States military bases. So 2 of the 3 strategic areas, 40 South Vietnamese cities and towns. Number 2, 12 U.S. military bases. Now, Bert, tell them what they even had the balls to attack. That's untouchable.
South Korean or South Vietnamese capital, Saigon.
And what's in Saigon that you don't touch, ever? The United States Embassy there. They even attacked the United States Embassy in Saigon, which is, I mean, that is off limits. You know what I'm saying? That's a protected area. So within a 24-hour period of time, more than 84,000 Viet Cong soldiers stormed the following strategic areas in South Vietnam. Number 1, 40 South Vietnamese cities and towns. Number 2, 12 United States military bases. And number 3, they even attacked the United States Embassy in Saigon, an untouchable area.
How do you spell Saigon?
Saigon is S-A-I-G-O-N. Now, how do the American people know this happens? Television. Every bit of this is on television. We've got news crews on the ground all over South Vietnam, and they are sending these assault pictures back, and the American people are horrified at what they're seeing. In the first 48 hours of fighting, 232 American soldiers were killed and 900 wounded. In the first 48 hours of fighting during the Tet Offensive, American soldiers killed was 232 and